What's up everyone, how's it going? In this video I'm going to be comparing the Canon 70D to the Sony A7S Mark II. Now the reason I have access to both these cameras, this camera is mine and I got it a few years back from doing a campaign, but I have created a 45-minute special with this, a music video, many videos and vlogs on my channel, so I have a good amount of experience using this camera. And the Sony A7S belongs to Nimiq, which is a cryptocurrency startup and I've been working with them doing all of their videos for a bit over a year now. And I've also done a few music videos with this setup. So I feel I have a good amount of experience with both of these setups. Now the lenses that we're going to be using for today, some comparisons. On the Canon we have the 10-18, this is an f4.5 at 10 millimeters, and then at 18 it's an f5.6. And then on the Sony we have the 16-35 constant aperture of f4. Now these are not the latest cameras from either of these brands, but I'll slightly cover on little improvements they made with new cameras. But as I mentioned, these are the two cameras that I have access to. So let's just jump right into the comparison, and then at the end I'll talk about the pros and cons and what I really like and what I really don't like about both of these cameras. Let's jump right into it. Okay, so we're just out here walking around and I have both cameras mounted on top of each other. And okay, so right now I am using the Picture Profile V4 from EOS HD Pro Color, but here's what auto looks like from Sony. This is what it looks like. This is automatic. Here, we'll flip around. So this is what the Canon's default settings look like. This is what the Sony's default settings look like. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of this, so I've been using the V4. Let me switch over to the EOS HD Pro Color V4. There we go. This is the EOS HD Pro Color. I find it's more similar to Canon. Still not exactly the same, but much more similar. So we're just gonna walk around and do some comparisons. By the way, this is the built-in microphone of the Canon 70D. This is the built-in microphone of the Sony A7S. And I found that the built-in microphone on the Sony is a bit better, at least from my experience. All right, let's flip around and just walk around a little bit so you can see how it compares. Right now we're walking towards the sun right in front. This is how the cameras deal with sun flares. By the way, both cameras are just recording on auto, so I'm not messing or fiddling about with the settings at all. I never film in full auto, I always film in manual or aperture priority to have more control. But for comparison like this, it makes more sense to do auto, so you can just see how they would automatically compare. Something to note is that when you're using the 70D, the screen stays nice and bright. So does the A7S too. But when you film in 4K on the A7S, the screen does dim down so that it doesn't overheat, I guess, or something, or maybe to save battery. So just standing here behind the camera, I can tell that the 70D screen is much brighter. This may not be like a huge deal for some people. You know, if you use an external monitor or something, that may not be a big deal. Now let's switch to some vlogging so you can see how the different cameras deal with skin tones. So, you know, it is a little windy, so this is kind of a good test to see how the built-in microphones deal with that. It's never going to be great, but maybe alright. So, you know, the Sony doesn't have a flip-out screen, but there is a solution to that, and that is to use an external monitor. There is Small HD, came out with one called the Small HD Focus, and it goes on top and it swivels around. That is much bigger. It's like $500, so that is an extra cost to go on top of the camera. But also, for some reason, when you use an external monitor with the A7, the Sony cameras, the A7, the A6000 series, you lose face track autofocus, which I'm not sure why that is. That's just really irritating. Now, you could use an external monitor and then just you manually focus it. But when you're vlogging, I'm like filming here and then I'm filming over there and I'm turning the camera around and I'm changing distances. I use autofocus a lot of the times, especially for vlogs. So face tracking, autofocus is necessary. All right, we're over here in a bit. Is the Sony camera even filming? That's a little irritating. I have no idea if the Sony camera stops recording or if something it overheats or who knows what. With the Canon, I look at the screen, I know it's recording all good, fine and dandy. But with the Sony, you're always for a surprise. All right, we're walking through here. It's a little bit shady, so you can kind of tell this is not low light. Once it gets dark out, we'll do some proper low light, but I'll put the clips right now. It is now nighttime, so we're doing a low light test, and I think we both can agree which one looks better, which one has a bit more detail tonight, and this is the only reason why I use the A7S Mark II is because of this low light capability. And something to think about is, you know, it doesn't matter how amazing a camera's color science is or how amazing the skin tones look. If it's in low light, you can't even see those nice skin tones, whereas on the camera with not such nice color science, you can see the image and stuff. A lot of the times, this one is going to be better for that time. And that's something people don't talk about. Everyone just says, Canon has better color science, Canon has better color science, but at nighttime, color science does not matter if you can't even see what's going on. Like, I just have some lights here. Now, I'm going to turn these lights off. Alright, it is pitch black out. I'm not sure if you can even see something on the Sony. If you can, that's crazy. But right now, the Sony is automatically it'll go all the way up to ISO 400,000, whereas the Canon 7D only goes up to 6,400. Just totally crazy. But honestly, when I'm filming, I never let the ISO go up this high. I make sure I never go past 12,800, which is still really high. But I'd say 12,800 on the Sony is the max for fairly clean footage, whereas on the Canon, as soon as I get to like 1,600, the footage begins to start being really grainy, not something that I'd be happy to put in a video. Since this Canon is an APS-C camera, it does crop by 1.6, so the 10mm lens turns into a 16mm, and the 18 turns into more of a 28, so it's more of like a 16 to 28. Now when I zoom the Canon all the way in, that's how far it reaches. When I zoom the Sony all the way in from 16 to 35, that is how far it reaches. Do note that the new Sony cameras like the A7 III do have a slightly different color science. So some people, from what I've read and heard, is that it's a bit better, it's better than like the A7S II, but it's still not going to be the same as Canon. And yep. Alright, so that's a wrap for the comparison shots, and I'll leave it up to you to decide which footage and which one you think is better in the different situations, because a lot of the time it's not like one camera it's better in every aspect. It's maybe better in certain times, and the other camera is better than other times. Alright, so personally, I never would buy an A7S II for my personal vlogs. And the simple reason is the screen does not fully articulate around. Now the screen does articulate like this, and a lot of videos are just about how they really just hate how the screen doesn't flip around, and that is only for if you're vlogging and filming yourself. But honestly, if I'm behind the camera, I actually prefer this screen over this screen, because it's like I can have the camera nice and just like close to me, it's very contained while I'm filming others. And if I'm filming other people, this screen is perfectly fine. It like works there's no benefit over, this has no benefit over this one, unless I'm filming myself, which is something I do quite a bit as a vlogger. And that is when the fully articulating screen is a must-have. Now, what advantages does the 70D have over the A7S? Well, of course the screen, but also it is a 20 megapixel camera. This camera has a higher megapixel count than this camera. This one is 12 megapixels, 20. Now, Sony has come out with the A7 III, which has more megapixels than the A7S II, but the Sony has always made the A7S series more video oriented, and then the A7R more photo, and then the A7 series just more like in between. Now if you're going to be doing mostly photography, the A7 III or one of the A7R cameras is much better option than this. This is more for if you're into video. But compared to these two, this one is better photos. Now there is the argument of color science. Canon has better color science. If you watch any video comparing, everyone just says Canon has better color science. But what's cool about the Sony is you can really adjust you can really tweak the settings. With the Canon, you don't have that much adjustability. The Sony, you can go in and mess with the picture profiles, and as I mentioned earlier, the neutral picture profile in this camera, not a huge fan of. Just auto on this camera I use quite often, and I like the colors of it. But there is this website called EOS HD Pro Color, and there's a guy who basically tweaks the picture profiles to develop one that is supposed to emulate Canon colors but for a Sony camera. So I've been using the EOS HD Pro Color version 4, which is for the A7S and A7R II, not for the newer Sony cameras. And the colors are much closer to Canon than just by default. So I've been using that quite a bit now. What other things? Well, of course, everyone knows the A7S Mark II is a low light beast, and that is the reason I recommended for Nimic to get this camera, is because a lot of the videos are done at nighttime and their vlog styles, run and gun, don't have time to set up lights and stuff. So this gives so much flexibility. People might say, yeah, but you know, ideally you set up lights for your shots to make the video look better and have the right mood and this and that. But you don't always have time. You don't have time to be there setting up lights when you're doing a vlog and stuff. And if you move here, move there, maybe you're on a train, and then you're on a plane and all this stuff, you can't set up lights. So that is when this camera really does shine. Low light, this camera just blows this camera totally out of the water. Quality, 4K at 30, 1080p at 30. Now, Canon does have the 80D, which was released little whiles after this one, and that one can do 1080p at 60. Canon does have the M50, which they released not too long ago, and that can do 4K, but then it crops in a ton, so it's basically just like a 1080p all-around camera. Canon does have the EOS R, but that camera crops in when you do 4K. Canon loves to crop in when you do 4K. Not cool, but that's just what they do, for now at least. So the Sony, if you want just the highest quality in terms of 1080p or 4K, the Sony wins hands down. Also, you can do 1080p 120 frames and get some really interesting slow-mos, which you just can't do with the 70D or the 80D. You can do 60 frames per second, but not 120. People on YouTube always say, you know, 4K doesn't matter. Most people only have a 1080p monitor, and while that's true, there are certain things that you can do with a 4K video clip that you just can't do with 1080p. You can do them, but you're going to lose a lot of quality. Like, if maybe I film a shot, but then I realize I want to crop in because there's something over in the corner that I don't want in the clip, I can crop in, and if I'm exporting at 1080p, I'm not going to lose any quality using this. Also, if let's say I film a clip, but it's kind of like I was kind of also doing something else, or there was a little bit of shake because there was like a bumpy ride, I can add some warp stabilization in Premiere, and even if it crops in a good amount, it's still going to be high quality 1080p footage. Whereas if I crop in too much on 1080p footage, you may not notice it too much at first, but if you crop in too much, you will start to notice that the quality is a fair bit amount less. Now, what about lenses? Because that is a big part of cameras with interchangeable lenses, is the lenses. Sony used to be known for having really poor lens selection, but they have come out with a lot new lenses. Now the reason I'm comparing with these two lenses, these are the two most common wide-angle lenses that people use with these cameras. This is the most common APS-C Canon, this is the most common full-frame Sony. Now Sony does have a 16-35 f2.8 G Master lens. That one is costs like twice as much as this lens, and it's not as common. Canon does have a 10-22 millimeter, which is like an f3.5 to something, but that lens doesn't have any stabilization. Oh yes, that brings me to stabilization. This camera has no in-body stabilization. This camera has 5-axis in-body image stabilization. So what that means is I can use any lens on this camera and I'll be able to have stabilization. With this camera, if I use something like the Sigma 18-35 f1.8, which is a really awesome, really well-known lens, it has no stabilization. Combined with this camera, no stabilization. So if I'm out filming, vlogging and stuff, the footage is very shaky. And I used to not really notice this because I always use lenses with stabilization, but then I tried a lens without stabilization. I really noticed the difference. So in terms of stabilization, Sony wins hands down. Now this lens does have OSS, optical steady shot, which works. Basically, it makes it so the in-body image stabilization doesn't have to work as much, and this lens does some of the work. With the Canon, this lens has stabilization, a little stabilization switch, but it doesn't compare to this, which is both. So for run and gun, you're gonna get much more stable footage. Now, what about battery life? Everyone talks about Sony battery life sucks. The Sony A7S II does not have the greatest of battery life, especially compared to the Canon 70D. But, this camera can charge with a micro USB to a power bank, whereas this camera, nor the M50, nor the EOS R, nor any of that, can charge with a micro USB port. Now, Sony on the A7 III and the A7R, the new A7R and A9 and stuff, they can charge with micro USB as well, but also they do have a bigger battery, which will probably be included with the A7S III. An advantage that both these cameras have over like point and shoots is they do have a microphone input. And by the way, this camera, the A7S II, has a headphone jack. This one does not. The 80D does, but this is the 70D, it does not. Now, with both these cameras, the built-in mics are not going to be as good as using an external microphone like this. This is the Rode Video Mic Pro, which I'll show you in just a moment using it. But with the A7S and the Sony's built-in mics, I personally think are much better than the Canon's built-in mics. So if you're maybe using this on a gimbal or something, you can't use an external microphone, the built-in mic on this is much better than this, at least from my experience. Now, when you use an external microphone, with the Canon cameras, it was always known that you needed to use something like the Rode Video Mic Pro to use the plus 20 dB, because the preamps on the Canon cameras, Canon DSLRs, are notoriously not that great. Whereas on the Sony cameras, the preamps are much better, much better. So, when I use the Rode Video Mic Pro on the, on the 70D like I'm doing right now, I have the Rode Video Mic Pro set to plus 20 dB, and then I have the preamps inside the camera set to plus 5. Now, when I use this same microphone on the A7S, what I have to do is turn the plus 20 dB down to 0, and then turn the preamps on inside of this camera up to about 14. That's because if I have the plus 20 dB, if I set inside of this camera, the A7S II, to plus 1, it is still, the preamps in here are still too good that it peaks. So when I'm recording other people talking, if they talk too loud or get excited, then the audio peaks. And that is basically when it just is too loud for the settings that you have, and that can be really hard to recover that type of audio. So let's switch over to I'm gonna switch over right now to the A7S. I'm gonna mount this on here. Whenever I'm filming others, I always use an external microphone because the audio is much more directional. But I'm gonna turn this on real quick. And the preamps that I have in here, I basically have to turn the dB on this Rode Video Mic Pro down to 0, because or else the audio peaks. This is the Sony A7S using the Rode Video Mic Pro with the audio level set to 0 and the built-in set to plus 14. The reason I'm talking about this is because with the Canon, to get the best audio, you're going to want to be able to have plus 20 dB. That way you can turn the audio levels inside of the camera much further down. But with the Sony, you can use something like a Rode Video Micro and still, which is a much smaller microphone, doesn't need an external, its own battery, and you can still get good audio because the preamps inside of this camera are much better. Still, the Mic Pro is going to be better, but it just gives you more flexibility. And honestly, I think the audio coming from this camera sounds better than this one when using an external microphone, at least in my experience. That's pretty much a wrap for this video, but I just wanted you to know that it doesn't really matter what camera you have. You know, having a bit of a better camera can make your workflow a bit easier sometimes, depending. But what's interesting is, although this camera is more expensive, it is actually a bit more of a pain using this camera than this one. There's a lot more settings and a lot more stuff, which could be a good thing because you have more flexibility, but it's easy to get confused. It's not, personally, I really prefer filming with the Canon because it just has like nicer dials, nicer buttons. I just prefer filming with this, but you can do certain stuff like crazy low light with this, which is the only reason that I would ever choose to use this camera, is because of the low light. If it wasn't insane in low light, I would not use this camera, but because of that low light, like, I will put up with a lot of irritating stuff because of that low light. Because at the end of the day, when you show somebody footage, if it's really, it doesn't matter how big of a pain it was for you to film. If the person who you're giving the footage to, or the person who you're creating the video for, they don't see all that, how big of a pain it is using that camera, but they see the finished video, and if it's really clean, then it can definitely be worth it. Which one do I prefer? For vlogs, 70D. For work for other people and where I don't have any control over the lighting and situation, the A7S Mark II. Both are great. Today's positive quote was sent in from Jacob Roberts. Jacob, right on, thank you for the quote. And this quote is, "Successful people take big problems and break them down into small, manageable ones. Unsuccessful people take a bunch of small problems, bundle them up together into one big, daunting problem." What this quote means to me is the best way to go about solving or doing something. Like right now, I'm working on a vlogger training course, and I'm not just going about it to edit. I don't just take all the footage, put it in Premiere, and just start editing hours of footage. No. I do sections at a time, organize it into separate folders. That way it's just like bite-sized pieces that I work on. It's much more enjoyable, much more fun, much more organized, and that is the best way to go about it. Imagine if I took like 50 vlogs and I put all the footage in my timeline and then tried to edit it. It would just be like overwhelming, not a good way. Feel free to leave a comment with your thoughts on these cameras. Maybe you own one of these, or if there's another camera that you think would work better than one of these in these different situations. Remember to keep always doing awesome stuff. I'll see you in the next one. Mosquito.